Good evening. It is Tuesday, January 18th, 2022. We've been looking at the parables of Jesus, and occasionally he involved the disciples in actions that had the same kind of storytelling mode. Today he included Peter in a series of events that had the same kind of teaching idea for Peter, and quite frankly helped Peter understand. In Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 to 27, and again I'm reading from the New Living Translation, second edition, he says, "On their arrival in Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and asked him, 'Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?' 'Well, yes, he does,' Peter replied. Then he went into the house. But before he had a chance to speak, Jesus asked him, 'What do you think, Peter? Do kings tax their own people or the people they've conquered?' 'Well, they tax the people they've conquered,' Peter replied. 'Well then,' Jesus said, 'the citizens are free. However, we don't want to offend them, so go down to the lake and throw in a line. Open the mouth of the first fish you catch, and you'll find a large silver coin. Take it and pay the tax for both of us.'" Poor Peter. You know, these kind of accusations from the Pharisees troubled the disciples. They didn't know what to do with those gotcha kind of questions. They came in with a half question, half accusation. Doesn't he pay the temple tax? What's wrong with him? Because if we can point out he doesn't pay the temple tax, then, but well, we've got him. It's a gotcha. We got him. And that always bothered the disciples. So Peter spoke impulsively. He usually did. He just blurted out, "Of course he pays it." And he didn't really have a clue whether Jesus paid it or not. You know, that whole idea of speaking before you think about it was one of the things Peter needed to work on. When I was a child once, my mother told me that I had diarrhea of the mouth and constipation of the mind. Took a while to figure out what she was saying, but sometimes I needed to think a little bit more before I blurted out the first thing that I thought of. He comes into the house and Jesus says, "What do you think?" It's a more polite way of saying, "Do you think?" But he wanted Peter to look at the issue of the Son of God paying a temple tax. What do you think? Peter, who gets taxed? Those that we've conquered or the family? Who pays taxes? The subjects or the ruling elite? Still a good question. Peter thinks about it for a minute and he says, "Well, it's the one that's conquered that pays taxes." And Jesus says, "That's right. The citizens are free. As citizens of heaven, we are free." But then Jesus says something else. "But in order not to offend." Let's not go around offending people just because we can. Let's not go around being offensive just because we're right. Let's not go around being obstreperous just because we can. Jesus actually sought to get along with the people who were out to get him. And then he tells Peter the most marvelous thing. He says, "Peter, you go take that fishing line of yours and you go down to the lake and you throw that line in, and the first fish that you catch, look at his mouth. And you're going to find a coin. And that coin's going to be big enough to pay your temple tax and my temple tax. And you run on down and pay it." Now, that's a miraculous fish. And I had a friend of mine that used to enjoy fishing, and every time someone asked him where he was, he said, "Well, he's just trying to be like Peter. What he's really doing is going out fishing and hoping that there's some money in the mouth of the fish." And he never did find Peter's fish, but he sure enjoyed looking for it. Can you imagine the look on Peter's face when every word that Jesus said came out to be true? throws the line in, catches a fish. Wow, there's the money to pay the tax. What Jesus is wanting Peter to recognize is that he's serving the God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, the God who can miraculously provide for the feeding of the 5,000, the God who can provide anything that we have needs, that recognizes who we are and what we need, and God can miraculously provide it. It's also interesting that Peter was a fisherman, and by fishing, God provided his need. And I think that's pretty cool too, because we forget that sometimes the way God provides for us is to give us the ability to go produce things and work for things and help ourselves take care of our needs by the gifts God has given us. And so here goes Peter, probably a little smugly, and he goes and he pays the temple tax for he and Jesus both. Of course he pays the temple tax, because God has miraculously provided it. How precious it is when we recognize that God is our provider. And sometimes the way he provides is by giving us gifts and talents and skills to work for our provision. And Peter doesn't need to be worried about gotcha questions, because he serves a God who provides love, provision, care, and forgiveness. May we recognize God's beautiful provision this week as we work hard, and we're not worried about those who have gotcha questions, because we trust in God. God bless you.